you very much, Sylvain. Actually, thank you to all the organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. Very interesting and relevant. And thank you for having me. Now, I hope you can all hear me correctly and also see my presentation. Okay, great. Then I'll start straight away. Now, my talk is going to be about Julius Scaliger's Doctrine of Minima Naturalia. Now, this doctrine, in general, the Corpuscularian doctrine of matter that Scaliger presents in the Exoteriche Exercitationes, has been the subject of recent studies by a number of important scholars, most notably Christoph Lüthi, who has uncovered the roots of this doctrine into the commentary tradition on Meteorologica Book 4, then William Newman as well, who has shown the importance of the alchemical medieval traditions to Scaliger's own corpuscularian theory of matter. Andrew Blank also more recently has also shown the relevance of the Galenic tradition, so the medical tradition transmitting through especially Girolamo Fracastoro. So in this presentation, my aim is merely to complement and enrich the picture in a sense of what these contributions have already brought to light, because it seems evident to me that in Scaliger's doctrine of Minima Naturalia, a lot of different traditions converge. What I'm going to do is simply to look at in a sense of the most obvious candidate to have influenced such a doctrine, that is the doctrine of Minima Naturalia as discussed by previous medieval and Renaissance commentators working on the physics, and especially Physics Book 1, Chapter 4, which is the locus classicus for the debate on Minima Naturalia. So what I purport to do in the presentation is, first of all, to introduce in very brief terms the scholastic tradition of Minima Naturalia and the main positions involved in the debate, the positions that especially will be relevant to Scaliger's own doctrine. Then I'm going to look at some equivocal uses of the expression of Minima Naturalia starting from the 14th century. So trying to really work onto how the expression was used in contexts which were not the traditional Aristotelian one. And finally, I'm going to look specifically at Scaliger's theory of Minima Naturalia, seeing how he basically makes use of both understandings of Minima Naturalia in order to sort of detail and specify his own theory. So first of all, starting with the scholastic tradition of Minima Naturalia. Now, just as a very basic introduction, let's say that the debate on Minima Naturalia, the very theory of Minima Naturalia, is not something that is clearly present in Aristotle. In Aristotle, we only have some scattered remarks about this issue that later started to be developed by commentators already in late antiquity, so as to develop the full-fledged theory. Now, the most important remark that we have in Aristotle is from Physics Book 1, Chapter 4, where Aristotle says that arguing against Anaxagoras' theory of matter, on the composition of corporeal substances, that if the parts of a whole may be indefinitely big or small, and by parts I mean components into which a whole can be divided and which are actually present in it, it is necessary that the whole thing itself may be of any size. Clearly, therefore, if it is impossible for an animal or plant to be indefinitely big or small, neither can its part be such, or the whole will be the same. But flesh, bone, and the like are the parts of animals, and the fruits are the parts of plants. Hence, it is obvious that neither flesh, bone, nor any such thing can be of indefinite size in the direction either of the greater or of the less. So Aristotle's argument is here based on the fact that heterogeneous substances, and especially living beings, are obviously have limits in size, both in greatness and in smallness. Now, what he seems to do here is simply to extend this argument, starting from living beings, to the homogeneous components of such living beings, such as flesh and bone for animals. So he's not really arguing about homogeneous substances in their own right, which is what is going to be at the center of the debates in the commentaries. If we now go to look at how, however, late ancient commentators started to discuss this issue, we already find a very important development in John Philoponus' physics commentary. Now, Philoponus can in many senses probably be considered the inventor of a proper theory of Minima Naturalia for homogeneous substances, although it is rather clear that there already are some important remarks, both in Themistius' physics commentaries and most likely also in Alexander's physics commentaries, although the fact that we basically lost the commentary makes it impossible to determine whether he actually had or hadn't already developed the theory that we find expressed in Philoponus' commentary. Now, the basic remark that Philoponus makes, the one that is going to be fundamental also for the medieval tradition of Minima Naturalia, is the fact that he distinguished between flesh, he's focusing on the case of flesh as an eponymous homogeneous substance, taken either as a form or as a magnitude. So the idea here is that if we consider simply flesh as an extended magnitude, so more in merely material terms in this sense, well, actually we cannot find a meaning because as a magnitude, flesh is always potentially infinitely divisible. Whereas if we consider it as a form, well, there is a clear limit of size to it. Nevertheless, now the important thing is that Philoponus explicitly talks of a minimal flesh, which he calls elakistes sarx. And he states that such a flesh is uncuttable. He uses the term, the adjective of atomos, but here the topic is really not bringing an understanding of atomism into this, but just to really show that this minimal flesh is something that cannot really have a smaller units. If we cut something from the minimal flesh, what we get is not flesh anymore. It is something that has already changed its nature as a substance. Nevertheless, Philoponus never details what exactly happens when a flesh is divided, when a minimal flesh is divided. And in general, his theory is more like just a hint to what minimal flesh can be. He introduces this concept, but does not really discuss it further, as we might want to do in a proper theory of Minima Naturalia. So when the debate reached the Latin West, the question of Minima Naturalia actually interested commentators to a great extent, so that a lot of different positions developed. Now, if we wanted to try to summarize the medieval Latin debate on Minima Naturalia, we could say that the basic distinction, one of which commentators themselves were aware of, is a distinction between intrinsic Minima Naturalia and extrinsic Minima Naturalia. Now, intrinsic Minima Naturalia simply Minima Naturalia which depend on causes internal to the substance itself, whereas extrinsic Minima Naturalia are Minima Naturalia which are determined by the action of an external substance onto the substance concerned. Now, the first kind of intrinsic Minima Naturalia, actually the strongest, I think really the strongest notion of Minima Naturalia that one can get into the debate is the notion of what I call minima secundum formam. Now, this idea is already clearly expressed in Averroes' long commentary on the physics, and Averroes is extremely important to the medieval Latin debate, and as we'll see also to Scaliger's own theory, not only for his own position, but also because Averroes was the one that made Latin commentators aware of the debate on Minima Naturalia in a sense. For instance, if you look at Grosseteste's physics commentary, we don't really see an aware, which probably precedes also a clear reception of Averroes' commentary on the physics. We do not still have a proper theory of Minima Naturalia. So it is very clear that Averroes raised the awareness of Latin commentators onto this. And Averroes' theory, which has been recently also reconstructed by Ruth Glasner in an important contribution, seems to be that actually the form itself determines within a substance the minimal quantity of matter with which it can be associated. So Minima Naturalia do not depend on the sort of contingent conditions into which a substance exists, but it is the very form that has a sort of associated property, the fact of requiring a minimal quantity of matter in which it inheres in order for a substance to subsist. So Averroes clearly speaks of a minimum quantitas, in this case of fire, finis, which is determined, determinata, and he restates this at length in various passages of his long commentary on the physics. Now, this theory, interestingly, did not find many adherents in the Latin West, although the most important advocate of it is certainly Thomas Aquinas, who basically in his physics commentary restates Averroes' theory in very clear terms, saying that natural form requires a determined quantity, such as also all the accidents, because he also extends this theory in a sense to the forms of sensible qualities, for instance. And this theory is also present in Peter of Auvergne again. But the idea of minima secundum formam was very much opposed by commentaries, at least starting from the 1270s in the Parisian Faculty of Arts. Most important opposition can be found in the Boethius of Dacia. Now, Boethius doesn't really mention, of course, the name of Aquinas, but it is very clear that he has in mind Aquinas' account of minima secundum formam. And the argument he presents against this view is a very interesting one. He basically says that, well, according to Aquinas' view of minima secundum formam, if we consider a substance in isolation, so imagine to take it without any containing medium, just consider a substance in itself, like fire or flesh or bones or any other kind of homogeneous substance. Now, by division, merely by division, according to Aquinas, we can at a certain point reach such a minimal quantity that if we divide it further, basically the substantial form of fire is corrupted. Well, Boethius claims that this is an illegitimate development because it violates a fundamental Aristotelian tenet, according to which you cannot really have a process of corruption without the generation of something else. But now, if we consider the substance, the fire in this case in isolation, well, merely by division, and division cannot be considered a corrupted agent, well, we have the corruption of fire, but we don't have a generation of anything else. So it is not really possible to assume that we can have such a strong notion of minima secundum formam. Of course, Boethius' argument is merely a thought experiment. He's not. He's the first to actually say that. Well, actually, when we have substances considering their natural environment, so to speak, well, then of course we cannot have a process of corruption without generation. But according to Aquinas, in principle, we could have it, and this is exactly the reason why he rejects this notion of minima secundum formam. And interestingly, Boethius' argument and the argument later also made by Scotus, which go in the same direction, seem to have influenced later commentators to such an extent that throughout the whole 13th and 14th century, we basically do not get a view of minima secundum formam restated in such clear terms. So just to have a very brief look at some alternative views of intrinsic minima naturalia in the scholastic debate, well, here I just present two main positions. I do not really go into the details, and of course, this is not an exhaustive list. But just to get an idea, for instance, already in around 1250 or 1260, Geoffrey of Aspall, in his very important physics commentary, introduces a completely different view, according to which minima do not really concern the persistence of substantial form within any quantity of matter whatsoever, but the ability of the form to act onto its external environment, so to perform its essential operation. This idea, which we also saw in Aurelian talk earlier, is what I call that of minima secundum actionem. Then, of course, we have various versions of it also in other early English commentators. The important thing in Aspall is that he also distinguished between the idea that a substantial form can sort of start to perform its essential operation, and he talks of actio inclinans, non tamen effectum consequens. So the idea is that he distinguished between the case in which a substantial form can start to perform its essential operation, but not, however, achieve it due to the fact that the substantial form is present in extremely small quantities of matter, and so that the virtus, the power associated with such quantities of matter, is too small to allow the form to basically achieve its proper operation. Also, this idea, however, of minima secundum actionem found important opposition in Paris in the 1270s. I'm not going to look into the details of this argument, but anyway, this is another view that gets abandoned later in the debate, although it seems to be still persistent in at least partially into the English commentary tradition. A similar view is that of minima secundum sensum. Here, the very basic idea, which is already present in Roger Bacon's question on the physics, is that you can also, and this is a sort of specification of the previous view, you can say that there is at least, at the very minimum, if you take extremely small quantities of matter, there is at least one operation that the substance concerned is not able to achieve, which is that of acting on the senses, because through our external senses, we are not able to perceive extremely small quantities of matter. So even if you don't want to say that in general terms, you take Aspal's view of minima secundum actionem, the very minimal case that you have to accept is that of the action onto the external senses. Now, this is also a view that seems to remain strongly present into the English commentary tradition, such as in Richard Middleton, and also in the 14th century in John Dumbleton, for instance. You can still see something very similar. Nevertheless, all these views remain, in a sense, either rejected or minor views into the later commentary tradition. The view that seems to emerge as the very prevailing one throughout the late 13th century and the whole 14th century is that of minima secundum corruptionem, so of extrinsic minima naturalia. That is to say, following Boethius of Dacia and especially John Duns Scotus in the Ordinatio, the criticism of the very idea of minima, of intrinsic minima naturalia, in all the views that I have presented, is so strong that it leads subsequent commentators to simply claim that, well, yes, to bite the bullet, to say we accept the idea that there are no intrinsic minima naturalia in homogeneous material substances, but still there are extrinsic ones. So the very basic position that is taken by further commentators is that of minima secundum corruptionem. The idea seems to be that you can get, and this is already expressed in the Parisian commentaries of the 1270s, but it is an idea that dates back also to Aristotle himself, that you can get in homogeneous material substances to quantities that are so small that if you divide them further, they are corrupted by the action of the external medium, such as air or water, so that they lose their substantial form and take on that of the containing medium itself. This is a very sort of general idea that allowed commentators to develop a wide spectrum of very nuanced and different views onto the details of this aspect. But you could say that for the late 13th century and the whole 14th century, the basic framework into which minima naturalia were discussed is that of minima secundum corruptionem. This is present in Boethius of Dacia, and of course, this is also the position to which Scotus resorts after criticizing the idea of extrinsic minima naturalia. This is a position that is also present in Occam in a sense, although Occam does not really delve much into the whole issue of minima naturalia. But what you see in the 14th century, in the mature 14th century, although it is something already present in Walter Barley's physics commentary, is that, well, once you accept minima secundum corruptionem, still you could try to claim that even this notion is too strong to discuss minima naturalia, because, well, in Walter Barley, we start to see a development that is something very curious. So Barley, in his physics commentary, seems to claim, and this probably depends on his idiosyncratic understanding of the relationship between substantial change and alteration. He seems to claim that basically once you consider process of substantial change of a sort of homogeneous material substance, well, this substantial change is preceded by a process of alteration, of progressive alteration. And although in strict Aristotelian terms, you should say that the substantial change is a discrete process, not taking place through time, but an instantaneous process. Well, alteration is not. Alteration is a progressive process taking place through time. So Barley seems to say that actually he seems to be conflating alteration and substantial change and saying that already when you start alterating an homogeneous substance by the action of the containing medium, what happens is that the substantial forms starts to be corrupted, so that substantial change is not the corruption of substantial form to occur, but it is rather the end of the corruption, and so the end of the generation of the new substantial form into that same matter, which is of course the form of the containing medium. This is something very interesting that would really need further studies. But Barley resorts to the notion of minimum circumstantionatum. So the idea seems to be that the homogeneous substance can resist to the action of the medium, which starts to alterate it throughout a certain time. And throughout that time, basically, there is a progressive loss of the substantial form itself. This idea is detailed in much clearer terms in Buridan and also than in Nicola Rem and in their physics commentaries. And here there is a very clear understanding. In Buridan is still partial understanding, but it becomes very clear later, that actually substantial form is taken to have quantitative parts, extended parts, so that basically the idea is that when you have the corruption of homogeneous material substance by the containing medium, what happens is that the parts of the materials, the parts of the substantial form of the substance concerned are progressively corrupted. So, and Buridan is very explicit to say, so that basically each part of the substantial form tries to resist to the action of the corrupting medium, so that the external parts of the substance concerned lose their substantial form before the sort of central parts. He has a very neat example of this Parvus Ignis, the small fire in the depths of the sea, where he basically claims that the external parts of the fire lose their substantial form before the sort of the core parts, the central parts. The same idea is also present in Orem, and I could say that probably, of course, here there seems to be an influence of Barley in a sense, at least in the way Buridan frames the issue, but there is also an influence of probably of Occam's conception of the merological structure of substantial form, something that Calvin Normor has detailed in an important article. Anyway, what is important to my talk here is that basically this whole debate seems to, in a sense, make the very notion of Minima Naturalia something which didn't have a strong content anymore, because you could always say that, yes, well, throughout the process of substantial change, well, you can infinitely divide the time through which the process happens, because now we're not conceiving it as an instantaneous process. And so at any time within the process, you still have a quantity of which you can have a smaller one, which still preserves its substantial form. So in a sense, the very idea of a minimum naturale seems to be vanishing in the Latin debate at the very same time in which the expressions of minimum naturale, of minima naturalia, becomes used by commentators, because the other important point is that in the 14th century commentaries, here I have put just a few examples, well, they start to use the expression of minimum naturale, something which was not so common into previous commentaries. So what you see is a very strange situation in which you have an expression, which is a very pregnant expression, of course, that of minimum naturale, which is associated with a very weak theoretical content, in the sense they become very thin concepts. So that what I have witnessed is that basically, and this is my interpretive hypothesis, the expression of minima naturalia at that point was sort of free to be used by thinkers with very different attitude to the composition of material substances. So that basically the expression of minima naturalia became used in completely different contexts, and authors having corpuscular or atomistic understanding of matter basically felt legitimate to employ the expression to indicate something completely different and equivocal with respect to Aristotelian minima naturalia. Of course, there is a forerunner to this sort of identification, and this is a text to which Aurélien has already referred earlier in the morning, so I won't deal with it further. This is the passage where Albert the Great conflates Democritus atoms and minima naturalia. But what I really want to see now is that, and here again we get to texts that also Aurélien has already covered, starting with Nicolas of Autrecourt, you clearly see the intent to use the Aristotelian doctrine, the Aristotelian notion of minima naturalia to refer to some sorts of atoms. Although in Autrecourt, you still don't have the very use of the expression of minima naturalia to refer to atoms. He simply refers to the Aristotelian dictum that ente naturalia esse terminata ad maximum et minimum. Whereas, and this is the same also for Nicolas Bonetus, but once you get to Wycliffe, at the very least, you see that here the minima naturalia, the expression of minima naturalia, comes to indicate specific particles, in this case, which are, of course, close to molecules than purely understood atoms. And what you see is that Wycliffe very clearly says that the gradum minimum can be called minimum naturale, gradum minimum of this kind of particles. Of course, it is debatable whether this conception had any influence on on further Renaissance thinkers such as Scaliger. But I think that Aureliana has already detailed the fact that Wycliffe's atomism seems to have persisted throughout his disciples, and so there might have been some sort of at least indirect influence onto later conceptions. Anyway, be what it may, I think that this Wycliffe's case illustrates the fact that really Minima Naturalia towards the end of the 14th century and later started to be used as an expression to indicate something completely different and equivocal with respect to Aristotle's Minima Naturalia. Now, let's get directed to Scaliger after this very, very long detour. In Scaliger, I have already detailed the fact that there are many different traditions converging. So you have the meteorological tradition underlined by Luti, you have the Galenic tradition studied by Blanc, and you have the alchemic tradition studied by Newman. Nevertheless, when you get to the text of the Exoteric Exercitationes, and I'm referring specifically to Exercitatio 16, which is the only exercitatio where Scaliger presents a specific account, a specific section dedicated to the concept, to the very concept of Minima Naturalia. Well, the first thing that you notice is that here, Minima Naturalia seems to be the very same notion of minima secundum formam. So what I've witnessed that Scaliger seems really to revert to the strongest interpretation of Minima Naturalia, the word dating back to Averroes and later adopted by Aquinas and Peter of Auvergne, and seems to be using it to basically ground the existence of particles, which are particles, of course, being able to exist separately in X. So nothing like the minima secundum form of the medieval debate, but still interpreting in a way which is extremely close to the way in which these minima were justified in the scholastic tradition. Especially, basically here, Scaliger refers to an example that is, in a sense, a really bizarre one. He refers to the passage of Physics, Book 8, where Aristotle talks about a stone which is basically eroded by subsequent drops of water. And what Scaliger says is that, well, basically only the last drop of water is able to take away the substantial form of the stone, and so this last portion of the stone remaining is basically the minimum naturale. But he talks about this minimum naturale as being the first part in composition and as being also the first part in motion. This is also something which is interesting because he seems to interpret minima naturalia as referring to magnitudes as well as motion. Another aspect that is really distinctive of Averroes' theory of minima naturalia. And basically when he talks about these minima, he seems to be resembling a passage from Averroes' commentary, long commentary on the physics, where Averroes says that the primum motum in ignes, minima parsque potestas ignis in actu, with the very background idea I have already referred to of the fact that the term means the minimum of matter into which it can inhere. Now, of course, Scaliger passage is not explicit enough to allow one to claim that he's really referring back to this Averroistic conception. Nevertheless, there might be a possible intermediary here. That is Agostino Nifo. In his physics commentary, Nifo discusses at length the issue of minima naturalia in the context of commenting on Book 1, Chapter 4. And after presenting a host of different positions, he comes to express his own view. And interestingly, his view in this case is explicitly acknowledged as being Averroes' own position, because Nifo claims that propter ec absolute cum peripatetis essentio, and he acknowledges the fact that he is taking a view of minima naturalia as being intrinsic minima naturalia. He talks of the fact that they are minimum inclusive, but here the notion is really the same one. As he says that there are minima immaterial substances which are minima ex parte intrinseca. And he says, ubi debet scire ut colligitur ab Averro indictis locis, quod radix terminationis et forma, e qua proficicitur actio et species. So here he seems really to be referring back to the conception that the form determines the quantity of matter with which it can be associated. And he says, et ita videtur forma determinata maximo et minimo, qui est forma activa licuius effectus, quae magere non potest sub quacunque quantitate. And he says, ec expositio omnium peripateticorum, it seems to be taking this as a sort of consensus position, which is of course not what was going on in the previous debate. But it seems to be really the case that here NIFO is really adopting a very strong conception of minima naturalia as minima secundum formam. If this is the case, and if this position can also be sort of shown to be a very present one into the Paduan Averroistic tradition of the late 15th century and early 16th century, which is the very same tradition into which Scaliger was educated, well, then probably we could say that this is a tradition which is closely influencing Scaliger into the exercitationes. And this would be very interesting to acknowledge, because we have seen that this is a position that seems to be at the entire opposite of the late 14th century view of minima naturalia. Now, nevertheless, of course, even if we say that Scaliger is adopting this conception of minima secundum formam, he puts it to a completely different use, because he treats minima naturalia as corpuscles, being able to explain a host of different phenomena. Here I have listed only the most important ones that are explained through a sort of corpuscular behavior of minima naturalia. So when my hypothesis is that when Scaliger is describing phenomena like rarefaction and condensation, of which we have already heard about, or the most important case, of course, the problem of mixture in corpuscularian terms, referring to the behavior of minimal particles as minima naturalia, he's basically, he feels legitimate to talk of minima naturalia in this corpuscularian way because of the previous equivocal developments that they have sort of underlined, starting with Autrecourt and then especially with Wycliffe. But at the same time, he's justifying the existence of this minima, referring to the notion of minima secundum formam from the previous Averroistic tradition. So he seems to be conflating the two traditions that I have detailed before. And we see this, I think we can try to see this in the case of mixture, because recall that in his famous Exercitatio 101, Scaliger basically says that mixture depends by the contact, the mutual contact of these what he calls here corpora minima, or which really works as a synonym for minima naturalia. But when you look at the kind of mixture that you can get, he distinguished a kind of mixture, which is that, for instance, between wine and water, where he talks of parts of minima naturalia of wine and water joining together so as to form a continuum corpus, so that materially there is no way to say that they remain distinct as particles, still retaining their forma propria. So the idea seems to be that, in a sense, the true nature of Scaliger's minima naturalia is that of hylomorphic minima, where really what matters, the corpuscularian aspect is not given by matter itself, but by the form. In a sense, at the mere level of matter, you in a mixture, you do not have separated corpuscles. You do not have corpuscles that retain their own even numerical identity. Still, you have corpuscles that retain their proper form. So I think that here you can get to a notion that I try to define with an oxymoron of corpuscles secundum formam, where the idea is very much to underline the fact that Scaliger is here conflating using minima secundum formam in order to detail a corpuscularian conception that is something really really different from, I think, previous corpuscularian conception of the 14th and even 15th century. So just to conclude, what I try to show is that there are at least two further traditions working in defining what are Scaliger's minima naturalia, the Averroistic tradition of minima secundum formam and the corpuscularian equivocal uses of the expression of minima naturalia. The influence of Averroes seems to be a very, very important aspect to be further investigated, as are the resemblances with previous corpuscularian thinkers. At the same time, what is important to underline is that Scaliger really inaugurates a new understanding of Minima Naturalia, together with Nifo and the previous commentary tradition starting from the late 15th century, especially in the context of Paduan Aristotelianism. And this important change, which also represents a strong opposition to 14th and early 15th century views of Minima Naturalia, I think is really a very important aspect that needs a lot of further investigation, because it seems to represent a sudden discontinuity into the history of Minima Naturalia, and one which really is at the heart of the further early modern development of corpuscular matter theories. So thank you very much for your attention, and after this very long talk, thank you very much.